The distant sound of sirens echoed through the streets of the city as the night sky glowed orange. Flames raged uncontrollably, consuming the towering high-rise in the heart of downtown. Firefighters battled the blaze, their hoses spraying arcs of water that seemed feeble against the towering inferno. Among them was Captain Daniel Mercer, his face covered in soot, his eyes sharp with focus. He was a man accustomed to chaos, having seen fires of every scale during his 20 years of service. But tonight was different. Tonight felt more intense, more dangerous. His team worked tirelessly, pushing their way into the heart of the burning building to rescue the remaining occupants. Daniel was the last to enter, disappearing into the thick smoke, determined to find a young woman reported trapped on the upper floors. It was the last anyone saw of him. Hours passed. The flames were finally subdued, the water turning to steam as it hit the scorched remains of the building. Yet, there was no sign of Daniel. His crew searched frantically, calling out for him, but the only response was the eerie silence of smoldering ruins. When the chief called off the search, it felt like a death sentence. The men who had fought beside him, who had trusted him with their lives, stood in stunned silence. Captain Daniel Mercer was missing, presumed dead. Jessica Mercer stared blankly at her phone as the words were played in her mind, over and over. Daniel's missing. He never came out of the building. The message had come from one of his fellow firefighters just an hour ago, and since then, she had been sitting in the same spot, numb, unable to process the gravity of the situation. The kids were asleep upstairs, unaware that their world might have just shattered. Jessica could hear the faint hum of the refrigerator and the soft ticking of the clock in the kitchen. Everything else was still. Too still. Her heart pounded in her chest, but her body wouldn't move. She wanted to scream, to call the fire station, to demand answers, but a part of her knew that no amount of questioning would change anything. Her husband, the man she had built her life with, was gone. Just like that. At the fire station, Chief Warren Gray struggled to maintain composure as he delivered the news to his crew. The loss of Captain Mercer hit them all hard. He wasn't just a colleague, he was a mentor, a friend, and a hero to many. Chief Gray had been with him through countless fires, each more dangerous than the last. But tonight, something had gone horribly wrong. "We'll resume the search at first light," the chief said, his voice thick with emotion. "But for now, we have to assume the worst." Meanwhile, in their suburban home, Jessica's teenage son Luke sat in his room scrolling through old photos of his dad on his phone. His father, the man he idolized, had been his hero since childhood. Luke always knew that being a firefighter was dangerous, but his dad had always come home. Every time. Tonight, though, something felt different. A knot tightened in his stomach, and he clenched his fists, fighting the tears that threatened to fall. What if Dad doesn't come back this time? The thought sent a cold wave of fear through him. He tried to push it away, to stay hopeful, but the uncertainty gnawed at him, making it hard to breathe. The next morning came too soon. Jessica sat at the kitchen table, her hands wrapped around a mug of untouched coffee. She hadn't slept. The children, still blissfully unaware, sat at the table, eating breakfast. Luke, however, could sense something was wrong. He watched his mother closely, noticing the tightness in her expression, the faraway look in her eyes. Just then, the phone rang, breaking the silence. Jessica grabbed it quickly, her heart racing as she answered. "Mrs. Mercer, this is Chief Warren Gray." His voice was calm, but Jessica could hear the strain beneath it. "Do you have any news?" she asked, barely able to keep her voice steady. "We searched the site again this morning," he began. "But we haven't found anything. The structure's too unstable to continue searching deeper. I'm so sorry, Jessica. At this point, we're considering him gone." Gone. The word hit her like a punch to the gut. Jessica's breath caught in her throat as the reality of it all finally sank in. She didn't want to believe it. Daniel couldn't be gone. Not like this. Not without a body, not without an explanation. He was too strong, too experienced to be lost in a fire. But the chief's voice left no room for doubt. The call ended, and Jessica was left standing in the empty kitchen, the weight of her grief pressing down on her. She had always known this day might come. Being married to a firefighter meant living with that constant undercurrent of fear. But she never truly believed it would happen to them. Not to Daniel. He was invincible. Or so she had thought. Later that evening, the news of Captain Mercer's disappearance spread quickly through the community. Neighbors stopped by with casseroles and condolences, but Jessica barely noticed. She was lost in her thoughts, replaying her last conversation with Daniel over and over again. She hadn't even said goodbye that morning. It had been a regular day. A kiss on the cheek, a casual, "see you tonight." Now, she might never see him again. That night, after everyone had left and the house had fallen silent, Jessica sat in Daniel's favorite chair in the living room, clutching one of his old fire station jackets. The smell of smoke and ash clung to it, a reminder of the dangerous life he led. Tears slipped silently down her cheeks as she hugged the jacket to her chest. It wasn't just the loss that hurt, it was the unknown. She didn't have closure, she didn't have answers. All she had was a void, a painful, gaping void where her husband used to be. The days passed in a blur, filled with preparations for a memorial service that felt surreal. How could they hold a funeral without a body? Jessica refused to believe Daniel was truly gone. Deep down, a part of her clung to the hope that he had somehow survived, that he was out there, somewhere, waiting to come home. But as the days stretched into weeks, and no new information came, even that hope began to wane. The world was moving on, but Jessica was stuck in place, trapped in the limbo of uncertainty. The days following Daniel's memorial service passed like a blur for Jessica. It was an event she had dreaded, not only because of the finality it symbolized, but because it was based on a presumption, one she wasn't willing to accept. Her husband's body had never been found, and that fact gnawed at her like an unrelenting ache. The service had been modest, attended by Daniel's fellow firefighters, neighbors, friends, and even people from the city who had heard about the missing hero. They shared kind words, offered hugs, and brought flowers, but none of it felt real to Jessica. As she stood beside the urn filled with symbolic ashes, since there was no body to cremate, her heart screamed that something wasn't right. 2 weeks later, the fire department declared the investigation into the fire officially closed. The building had been a derelict warehouse, abandoned for years, according to reports. There was nothing suspicious on the surface, just faulty wiring that had sparked the blaze. No signs of foul play, no reason for further scrutiny. But for Jessica, the unanswered questions haunted her. How could Daniel, the most experienced firefighter in the city, have vanished without a trace? Why had no one been able to find even a scrap of his uniform, let alone his body? And why did the official report from the fire department seem so rushed, so willing to move past the incident? Her thoughts grew darker when she began piecing together the small, overlooked details. At the memorial service, one of Daniel's close colleagues, Marcus O'Connor, had pulled her aside, offering condolences with a strange look in his eyes, one that suggested there was more to say. "You know," Marcus had whispered, his voice thick with guilt, "Daniel mentioned some things, before that night. Things about the department, and that building." He glanced around, as if checking to make sure no one was listening. "Maybe it's nothing, I don't know, but you should look into it." Jessica's mind had been too clouded with grief at the time to pursue Marcus's cryptic message. But now, as the initial shock of loss wore off, his words kept resurfacing, pricking her like thorns. What had Daniel said to Marcus? What was it about the building that had concerned him? And why did Marcus seem so hesitant to speak openly? One evening, as she sat in the dimly lit living room, Jessica found herself replaying Daniel's last conversations in her mind. There was one memory in particular that stood out, a conversation over dinner just a few weeks before the fire. Daniel had been unusually quiet, distracted even. When she had pressed him about it, he had shrugged it off, saying something about the fire department's bureaucratic nonsense and an odd new policy that didn't sit right with him. "I can't talk about it right now," he had said, frustration evident in his voice. "It's just a mess. Corruption, mismanagement. It goes deeper than you think." At the time, Jessica had assumed it was just work stress. Daniel had always been passionate about his job, sometimes too passionate, but now she wondered if he had been trying to tell her something more. Could it be connected to his disappearance? A few days later, Jessica decided to visit Marcus. She needed to know what he had meant at the memorial, and her growing suspicion wasn't something she could ignore any longer. When she arrived at his apartment, Marcus looked nervous, his eyes darting toward the door as if someone might be watching. "Jessica? What are you doing here?" he asked, his voice tense. "I need answers, Marcus," she said, her tone sharper than she intended. "At the memorial, you hinted that Daniel mentioned something about the building, the department. I need to know what it was." Marcus hesitated, rubbing the back of his neck. "Look, I don't know if I should." "Please," Jessica interrupted, her eyes pleading. "He's gone. I have nothing left but questions. Help me understand what happened." Marcus sighed, motioning for her to come inside. They sat at the small kitchen table, where Marcus kept his voice low, as though afraid the walls had ears. "Before that night, Daniel had been looking into something," Marcus began. "There were rumors about some shady deals going down in the department. Contracts being awarded to companies that had no business getting them. Daniel wasn't one to keep quiet about corruption. He started asking questions, poking around. The higher-ups didn't like that." Jessica's heart raced. "What kind of deals?" Marcus shifted uncomfortably. "I don't know the specifics, but Daniel mentioned the warehouse, the one that burned down. He said it wasn't as abandoned as it seemed. That night, before he went in, he told me to watch my back. Said there was something about that building, something dangerous." Jessica felt a chill run down her spine. But why would that lead to his disappearance? "I don't know," Marcus admitted. "But after the fire, some things didn't add up. The reports were inconsistent. It was like they wanted to wrap it up fast, sweep it under the rug, and now Daniel's gone." Jessica's mind whirled with new possibilities. Could Daniel have discovered something in that building, something that had made him a target? Was his disappearance part of a larger cover-up? Later that night, Jessica sat in her living room, going over everything Marcus had told her. Her suspicion grew stronger with each passing hour. If Daniel had been investigating corruption in the fire department, and if that investigation had somehow led to his disappearance, then the official narrative about the fire couldn't be trusted. Determined to find answers, she decided to visit the fire department the next day. She needed to see the incident reports for herself, to find out what they were hiding. The weight of uncertainty pressed heavily on her, but beneath it was something else. A simmering anger. If Daniel had been taken from her because of some conspiracy, she would stop at nothing to uncover the truth. The following day, Jessica made her way to the fire station, her heart pounding as she approached the familiar building. The firefighters there had been like a second family to Daniel, and yet now, standing outside, she felt like a stranger. Something had shifted. Something dark was lurking beneath the surface. When she asked for the incident reports from the night of the fire, she was met with resistance. The records officer, a stern woman named Helen Pierce, claimed the reports were confidential, citing departmental protocol as the reason. "I'm his wife," Jessica argued, her frustration boiling over. "I have the right to see them." Helen's gaze remained cold. "I'm sorry, Mrs. Mercer, but there's nothing more I can do. The case is closed." Jessica left the station empty-handed, but her determination only grew stronger. There was something in Helen's eyes, something that told her the woman knew more than she was letting on. As she stepped into the cool evening air, a realization struck her. If the department was involved in covering up Daniel's disappearance, she couldn't rely on official channels. She needed to dig deeper, to find someone who could give her access to the truth. That night, as Jessica sat in bed, staring at the ceiling, she made a decision. She would follow the trail, no matter how dangerous it became. If there was foul play involved, she would expose it. Daniel had been taken from her, but his story wasn't over yet. In the dark, she whispered a promise to her husband. "I'll find out what happened to you. I won't stop until I know the truth." As Jessica's investigation deepened, so did her growing sense that her husband, Daniel, had been caught in something far bigger than either of them could have imagined. The fire, his disappearance, the uneasy way the fire department had handled everything. It all pointed to a larger web of secrets. But what disturbed Jessica most was the gnawing feeling that Daniel had known more than he'd told her. Could he have been hiding something from her to protect her? She couldn't let that thought fester any longer. It was time to uncover the truth about the man she loved, the man she thought she knew completely. The following morning, Jessica sat in the small, cluttered office of a private investigator named Eli Morgan. His reputation was as murky as his past, but his name had come up when she had quietly asked around for someone willing to bypass the usual red tape. Eli was known for finding answers when no one else could, and for not asking too many questions about the legality of it all. Eli, a wiry man in his mid-40s with a graying beard and sharp eyes, leaned back in his creaky chair, his fingers tapping rhythmically on the desk as he listened to Jessica recount the events of the last few weeks. His face remained impassive, though his eyes seemed to grow more focused as she detailed Daniel's investigation into the fire department and the strange circumstances surrounding his disappearance. When she finished, Eli was quiet for a moment, the room filled with the faint hum of the ceiling fan. Then he leaned forward, folding his hands. "So, you think your husband stumbled onto something?" "Someone didn't want him to find," Eli said, his voice low and measured. "And now you want to know what that something is?" Jessica nodded. "I need to know why he's gone. If there's corruption involved, I want to expose it." Eli regarded her for a long moment, his eyes searching her face. "You realize, once we start digging into this, there's no turning back. You're going after powerful people here. If they've already made one person disappear, they won't hesitate to do it again." Jessica's stomach twisted, but she forced herself to meet his gaze. "I'm not afraid of them. I owe it to Daniel to find out what happened." Eli's lips curved into a faint, approving smile. "All right then, let's get started. I'll begin by looking into the fire department, see if there are any skeletons in their closet. But you—" He paused, his eyes narrowing slightly. "You should start looking closer to home. If your husband was keeping secrets, you need to figure out what he knew and why he didn't tell you." Jessica left Eli's office feeling a strange mix of determination and dread. Eli's words echoed in her mind. You should start looking closer to home. Was it possible that Daniel had hidden things from her? She didn't want to believe it, but the nagging sense of unease was impossible to ignore. Later that evening, as she sat alone in the living room, she found herself drawn to Daniel's study. It was a small room, tucked away in the back of the house, his sanctuary where he would spend hours reviewing paperwork, firefighting protocols, or occasionally reading books on tactics and strategies. She hadn't stepped foot in there since his disappearance, unwilling to disturb his space. Now, standing in the doorway, she took a deep breath and flicked on the light. The room was just as he had left it. His desk slightly cluttered with papers, a mug still sitting on the corner with a faint coffee ring on the wood. Jessica's heart ached as she moved further inside, her fingers trailing over the back of his chair. This had been where he had spent so many hours working, thinking, possibly hiding things. She started with the obvious, flipping through the stack of papers on his desk. Most were related to routine firefighting business, shift schedules, maintenance logs for the trucks, inventory lists of equipment. But after half an hour of searching, she found nothing that raised suspicion. That was until she opened the bottom drawer of his desk. Inside, tucked beneath an old ledger, was a small black notebook. Jessica's hands trembled as she pulled it out. She recognized it immediately. It was Daniel's personal journal. He had always kept one, though he had been private about its contents. As she flipped through the pages, she found familiar entries, casual musings about his day-to-day life. But as she neared the final pages, her heart raced as the tone shifted. April 17th. Something strange is going on at the station. I can't shake the feeling that I'm being watched. Some of the guys have been acting weird, nervous, cagey, like they're hiding something. I've tried to ask questions, but no one's talking. I need to be careful, but I can't let this go. April 22nd. Heard a conversation I wasn't supposed to today. It was about the warehouse, the one that burned down last year. They were talking about something inside, something valuable. But what would be in an abandoned building? May 3rd. I've been digging, but I'm starting to worry I've gone too far. Some of the higher-ups are involved in this. The more I find out, the more dangerous it becomes. If something happens to me, Jessica needs to know the truth. Jessica's breath caught in her throat as she read the final entry, dated the night of the fire. May 10th. It's happening tonight. I have to go to the warehouse, but I don't know if I'll make it out. I've found too much. If you're reading this, Jess, I love you. I'm sorry I didn't tell you sooner, but I couldn't put you in danger. I'm going to try and stop this, but if I don't come back, don't trust anyone. Jessica's hands shook as she closed the journal, her mind reeling. Daniel had known. He had known something was going to happen that night. He had gone to the warehouse not as part of his job, but because he had uncovered something, and he had been trying to protect her by keeping it a secret. Tears filled her eyes, but they were tears of frustration and anger. He had kept her in the dark to protect her, but now she was left alone, trying to pick up the pieces of a mystery that had consumed him. She understood why he had done it, but it didn't make the pain any easier. The next day, Jessica returned to Eli's office, clutching the notebook in her hands. She placed it on his desk, her eyes burning with determination. Daniel was onto something, she said, her voice hard. He was investigating the warehouse fire and the corruption in the department. This notebook proves it. Eli picked up the journal, flipping through the pages with a critical eye. He let out a low whistle when he reached the final entry. Well, looks like your husband was deeper into this than I thought. This changes things. What do we do now? Jessica asked, her heart pounding. Eli leaned back in his chair, a gleam of intrigue in his eyes. Now we find out what exactly Daniel uncovered and who wanted him silenced. Jessica nodded, her resolve hardening. She would get to the bottom of this, no matter what it took. Daniel had been a man with secrets, but now that she knew the truth, she would stop at nothing to see justice done. The discovery of Daniel's journal changed everything. It wasn't just a missing persons case anymore. It was a race against time, a pursuit of truth that could be as deadly as the fire that had consumed Daniel's last known location. Jessica's mind raced with the implications of what she'd found. There were corrupt forces at play, and Daniel had been on their trail. After a sleepless night poring over the journal and piecing together Daniel's cryptic notes, Jessica returned to Eli Morgan's office the next morning. The hardened investigator was already waiting for her, his face showing the faintest trace of excitement. He had spent the night examining the journal as well, and there was one entry that particularly stood out to both of them. May 3rd, the warehouse that burned down last year. Something valuable inside, not just an accident. It was the lead they needed. The warehouse fire Daniel had referred to wasn't just any fire. It was the one that had sent shockwaves through the city the previous year, a mysterious blaze that had consumed a massive, abandoned industrial complex in the outskirts. Official reports had deemed it an accident, but Daniel clearly thought otherwise. And now, so did Jessica and Eli. I made some calls, Eli said, as Jessica sat down in front of his desk. That warehouse, it's still under investigation by insurance companies because of the high value of the property, but the police closed the case. They said it was an electrical fault. Classic cover-up. Jessica frowned. What was inside that would be so valuable? It was supposed to be abandoned. Eli rubbed his chin thoughtfully. That's the question, isn't it? Daniel was onto something there, and whatever it was, it got him killed, or worse. Later that day, Jessica and Eli decided to visit the site of the warehouse fire. The building, or what was left of it, stood at the edge of the industrial district, surrounded by rusting fences and overgrown weeds. The charred ruins had been left to rot, a forgotten monument to the tragedy that had unfolded there a year ago. As they approached, Jessica felt a chill run down her spine. The place reeked of secrets. They parked near the perimeter, far enough to avoid attracting attention, but close enough to see the remains of the building. The fire had ravaged the structure, leaving behind little more than blackened steel frames and piles of ash. Yet something about it felt off. It wasn't just the destruction. There was a quiet sense of menace lingering in the air, as if the ghosts of the past still clung to the place. As they neared the fence, Eli scanned the area. Look at this place. No way it was just an accident. You see the scorch patterns? Too intense for an electrical fire, especially for an abandoned building. Jessica nodded, her eyes narrowed as she took in the wreckage. So what was Daniel looking for here? Eli didn't answer immediately, instead gesturing for her to follow him around to the back of the building, where the fire seemed to have done the most damage. As they rounded the corner, They came across a section of the fence that had been cut open, recently, judging by the clean edges of the metal. Eli crouched down, inspecting the ground near the opening. "Someone's been here," he muttered, pointing to faint tire tracks leading away from the site. "Someone who doesn't want us looking too closely." Jessica's pulse quickened. "Do you think it's connected to Daniel's disappearance?" Eli stood up, brushing the dirt off his hands. "I think whoever Daniel was investigating is still covering their tracks, and they're not done yet." As they entered the warehouse, Jessica felt a surge of anxiety. The interior was dark and eerie, with beams of sunlight filtering through gaps in the roof, casting long shadows on the ground. The smell of smoke and burnt wood still lingered in the air, and the silence was oppressive. It was hard to believe that Daniel had come here, possibly on the very night of the fire that consumed him. Eli motioned toward a section of the warehouse that had once been a large storage area. According to the reports, the fire started over there where the chemicals were stored. But if you ask me, there's more to this story. Maybe Daniel thought the same. Jessica moved toward the scorched remains of what had once been storage crates. As she kicked aside debris, her foot struck something solid beneath the ash. She knelt down, brushing the dirt away, and uncovered a metal box, small and dented but surprisingly intact. Her breath caught. "Eli, look at this." He knelt beside her, his eyes widening as they both inspected the box. It was locked with a heavy padlock, the kind that wouldn't be used for ordinary storage. "This wasn't part of the fire," Eli said, glancing around. "It was hidden here." Jessica's heart raced as they pried the box open with a crowbar Eli had brought. Inside, they found documents, old, yellowed papers, but still legible. As they sifted through them, it became clear what they had stumbled upon. "Money laundering," Eli muttered, shaking his head in disbelief. "And lots of it. These records go back years. Offshore accounts, shell companies, all tied to the owners of this warehouse." Jessica's stomach twisted in knots. "That's why they wanted it destroyed." Eli nodded grimly. "Daniel must have found out about this and planned to expose it, and they silenced him before he could." As they left the warehouse, Jessica felt the weight of the discovery settle on her shoulders. This wasn't just about a fire. It was about corruption on a massive scale, one that had cost Daniel his life. But as they stood outside the ruins, her thoughts turned to what came next. "If we go to the police with this, they'll shut it down again," Jessica said. "Someone high up is protecting them." Eli glanced at the documents in his hand, his expression dark. "We need more than this to bring them down. There's someone pulling the strings, someone Daniel was getting close to." Jessica clenched her fists, her resolve hardening. "Then, we find them. And we finish what Daniel started." The discovery at the warehouse was a bombshell, but it was only the beginning. As Jessica and Eli delved deeper into the records, they realized that Daniel had stumbled upon a vast network of illegal activity. It wasn't just the fire. It was money laundering, fraud and bribery, all connected to powerful individuals who operated with impunity. But with every answer came more questions. Who was pulling the strings? And more urgently, who would silence Daniel before he could expose them? Back at Eli's office, the atmosphere was tense. The documents they'd retrieved from the warehouse were laid out on the table, each one a puzzle piece in a larger, far more dangerous game. Eli had been scanning through them, making notes, while Jessica paced the room, her mind racing. "This is bigger than we thought," Eli said quietly, his eyes scanning the paperwork. "These companies, they're all connected to one name." He looked up, meeting Jessica's eyes. "William Carver." Jessica felt a chill run down her spine. William Carver was a well-known figure in the city, a real estate mogul with a pristine public image, hailed for his philanthropy and investments in urban development. He was also someone who had the power, money, and influence to make problems disappear. "You think Carver is behind this?" Jessica asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "I don't just think it," Eli replied, pushing a document across the table toward her. "I'm certain of it. This account, it's registered to one of Carver's shell companies. All these offshore accounts and transactions, they lead back to him. And this warehouse? One of the properties he used to launder his money." Jessica stared at the document, her heart pounding. That's why Daniel was investigating the fire. He found out Carver was using it as a front. Eli nodded, his face grim. Carver's been doing this for years, and Daniel must have gotten too close. That's why he disappeared. Jessica's hands trembled as she clutched the document. And if we go public with this? Eli sighed heavily. We're going up against someone who owns half the city, Jessica. Carver has the police in his pocket. Judges, politicians, everyone who matters. If we're going to take him down, we need more than just these documents. We need someone on the inside. Jessica felt a wave of frustration. They were so close to the truth, but Carver was untouchable. How do we get that? Eli stood up and began pacing the room, deep in thought. Daniel wasn't just following the money. He was on to something bigger, someone in Carver's inner circle. If we can find out who that is, we might have a chance. A few days later, Jessica found herself standing outside the towering glass facade of Carver's corporate headquarters. She had never imagined she'd come this close to the man who had, for all intents and purposes, orchestrated her brother's disappearance. But Eli was right. They needed someone on the inside. And there was one person she suspected might be willing to talk. Her contact was Carver's former assistant, a woman named Rachel Langston, who had left the company under mysterious circumstances several months earlier. She had reached out to Jessica shortly after Daniel went missing, hinting that she had information about Carver's dealings. But until now, Jessica hadn't known how deeply involved Carver was. Rachel was their only lead, and Jessica needed answers. Later that afternoon, Jessica met Rachel at a small, nondescript cafe on the outskirts of town. The woman sitting across from her looked nervous, glancing around as if she was being watched. Her hands shook slightly as she sipped her coffee, but her eyes held a steely resolve. Rachel, Jessica began cautiously, I know this is dangerous, but you said you knew something about William Carver, about what he's been doing. Rachel took a deep breath, her voice low and tense. I know more than I should. I worked for him for nearly 5 years. I saw things that no one outside that office knows. Carver's not just laundering money, Jessica. He's tied to organized crime, drug trafficking, even human trafficking. Jessica's blood ran cold. How did Daniel get involved? Rachel hesitated, her gaze dropping to her hands. Daniel. He came to me about 6 months ago. He was looking into the warehouse fire, but he found more than he bargained for. He discovered that Carver was using his businesses to smuggle drugs into the country. I gave him everything I knew, but I didn't realize how far Carver's reach went. Jessica's throat tightened. What happened to him, Rachel? Do you know? Rachel's eyes filled with guilt. I think Carver found out that Daniel was getting close. He has people everywhere, police, private investigators. Daniel was under surveillance, but he didn't know it. The night he went missing, I think he was taken. And I think Carver had something to do with it. Jessica felt a wave of nausea. Why didn't you go to the police? Rachel gave a bitter laugh. The police? They're in Carver's pocket. Anyone who tries to go against him either disappears or ends up dead. I left the company because I was scared for my life. Jessica leaned forward, her heart racing. Then why talk to me now? Why risk it? Rachel's expression hardened. Because someone has to stop him. And because? I owe it to Daniel. He didn't deserve what happened to him. Jessica's mind was spinning. This was bigger than she had imagined. Carver wasn't just laundering money, he was a criminal kingpin, and Daniel had uncovered his darkest secrets. Now, Jessica had to decide what to do with that information. That evening, back at Eli's office, Jessica relayed everything Rachel had told her. Eli listened in silence, his face growing darker with every word. This changes everything, Eli said, running a hand through his hair. Carver isn't just a corrupt businessman, he's a full-blown criminal. If we're going to take him down, we're going to need evidence that ties him to all of this. Jessica nodded, her determination growing. Then we find that evidence. Rachel's willing to help, but we need to be careful. If Carver finds out what we're doing, we're all dead. Eli gave her a grim smile. Don't worry, I've got a plan, but it's going to take time, and we're going to need more than just Rachel's testimony. We need to hit Carver where it hurts. The weight of their newfound knowledge pressed heavily on Jessica and Eli. The more they learned about William Carver, the more dangerous their situation became. Carver's empire was vast, and the extent of his criminal activities was staggering. With Rachel's revelations, they knew they had to act carefully. One wrong move could be disastrous. The next step was clear. They needed concrete evidence of Carver's illegal activities that could withstand scrutiny and lead to his downfall. Jessica and Eli began their search for documentation that could tie Carver directly to the crimes Rachel had described. Their goal was to build a case strong enough to force authorities to act, but the enormity of the task was overwhelming. The following week, Jessica and Eli were entrenched in their investigation. Eli had tapped into his network of contacts, searching for any loose threads that could be pulled. They needed more than just Rachel's testimony. They needed financial records, contracts, and anything else that could definitively link Carver to the illegal operations. Jessica spent hours poring over documents at Eli's office, cross-referencing information and looking for patterns. The weight of her brother's disappearance was a constant presence, but it was this search for truth that drove her forward. The deeper they delved, the clearer it became that Carver had been meticulous in covering his tracks. But no criminal empire was perfect. There had to be something they could use. One afternoon, Eli burst into the office with a triumphant look on his face. "Jessica, you need to see this." He dropped a file on the desk, and Jessica's heart raced as she flipped it open. Inside were detailed records of financial transactions between one of Carver's shell companies and an offshore account. It was the kind of evidence they had been looking for, transactions that were too large and too frequent to be legitimate. "These are direct transfers," Eli said, pointing to the figures. "The amounts align perfectly with the shipments Rachel mentioned. And look at this. There's a notation about special arrangements. This could be the evidence we need." Jessica's eyes widened. Special arrangements? What could that mean? Eli frowned, studying the records. "It could be code for something illegal. We need to find out more about these arrangements and who's involved." Later that day, Jessica and Eli met with Rachel to share their findings. Rachel looked over the documents with a mix of relief and apprehension. "This is incredible," she said, her eyes scanning the pages. "But be careful. Carver will have his people watching you." Jessica nodded. "We know. We've already seen the lengths he's willing to go to protect his empire. But we need to get this information to someone who can use it." Rachel glanced nervously around the room. "There's a journalist I used to work with. His name is Tom Reynolds. He's known for exposing corruption. If anyone can make this public, it's him." Eli's eyes lit up. If Reynolds can get this story out, it might force the authorities to act. But we need to be sure he's trustworthy. Rachel nodded. "I'll reach out to him, but it's going to be risky. Carver's not the kind of man who takes threats lightly." A few days later, Jessica and Eli were at a secluded diner, waiting for Tom Reynolds. The journalist had agreed to meet them to discuss the evidence they had uncovered. The stakes were high. If Reynolds agreed to help, it could be the breakthrough they needed. But if Carver learned of their plans, they could be putting themselves in grave danger. Tom Reynolds arrived just as the sun was setting, his demeanor serious. He was a tall man in his late 40s, with a rugged appearance and sharp eyes that missed nothing. He took a seat across from Jessica and Eli, his gaze fixed intently on them. "I've looked over the documents," Reynolds said without preamble. "This is big. If it's accurate, it's a goldmine of information. But I need to be sure you're not setting me up. Carver's people are everywhere." Jessica took a deep breath. "We're not setting you up. My brother disappeared because he uncovered something he shouldn't have. We're trying to expose the truth, but we need your help to make it public." Reynolds studied her face for a long moment before nodding. "All right, I'll take the information, but we need to be cautious. I'll verify the details and see if we can get some media coverage. But be prepared, Carver won't take this lying down." Eli handed over the documents, his expression serious. "Thank you, Tom. We're counting on you." The next few days were a whirlwind of activity. Reynolds worked behind the scenes, contacting trusted sources and preparing the story for publication. Jessica and Eli continued their investigation, trying to stay one step ahead of Carver's enforcers. Every shadow seemed to hold a threat, and every unfamiliar face felt like a potential danger. Then, just as things seemed to be settling, disaster struck. One morning, Jessica received a phone call that made her blood run cold. Reynolds had been attacked and hospitalized. It was clear that Carver's people had found out about their plans and were taking drastic measures to silence anyone involved. Jessica and Eli rushed to the hospital to check on Reynolds. He was in critical condition, but he managed to whisper a few words to them before slipping into unconsciousness. The files? Carver's main accomplice. Eli's face went pale. Who? Who's the accomplice? Reynolds' eyes flickered with pain, but he managed to croak out a name before he passed out. Henry Sullivan. Back at LA's office, Jessica and Eli stared at the name in disbelief. Henry Sullivan was a high-ranking official in the city's government, known for his public support of Carver's projects. If Sullivan was involved, it meant Carver's influence reached even further than they had imagined. "We have to find Sullivan," Jessica said, her voice trembling with determination. "If he's connected to Carver's crimes, he could be the key to exposing everything." Eli nodded. "But be careful. Sullivan will have security, and he's bound to be just as ruthless as Carver. We need to gather more evidence and figure out how to get it to the authorities." The revelation that Henry Sullivan was involved in William Carver's criminal empire shook Jessica and Eli to their core. The stakes had never been higher. Not only were they up against Carver, but now they had to contend with a powerful figure in the city's government. As they navigated this treacherous landscape, their path forward became even more perilous. The following morning, Jessica and Eli met in a quiet cafe to discuss their next move. The news of Reynolds' attack had spread quickly, and their own safety was increasingly in jeopardy. Jessica was particularly anxious, her face lined with worry as she sipped her coffee. "We need to act fast," Eli said, his voice low. "Sullivan is our best lead to bring down Carver, but we have to be smart about this." Jessica nodded, her fingers drumming nervously on the table. "Sullivan is a high-profile figure. If we're going to get to him, we need to gather indisputable evidence that will force the authorities to act. We also need to be prepared for whatever Carver throws our way." Eli pulled out a file from his bag, laying it on the table. "Here's what we know about Sullivan. He's got a lot of connections, and his political influence is vast. We need to find a way to get close to him and gather information on his involvement." Jessica's eyes scanned the file. It contained details about Sullivan's career, his business dealings, and his known associates. There was a list of high-profile events he attended, which included charity galas, fundraisers, and political gatherings. One event, in particular, stood out: a charity gala scheduled for the following weekend, where Sullivan was set to make a keynote speech. "This gala," Jessica said, pointing to the date in the file, "it's the perfect opportunity for us to get close to Sullivan. If we can attend and gather information, we might be able to find something that links him directly to Carver." Eli agreed, but with a note of caution. "We'll need to be careful. Security will be tight, and Sullivan will be surrounded by his people. We need a plan to blend in and gather information without drawing attention." A few days later, Jessica and Eli found themselves at the grand ballroom of a luxurious hotel where the charity gala was being held. The room was elegantly decorated with glittering chandeliers and elaborate floral arrangements. The attendees, dressed in their finest attire, mingled and chatted, their laughter and conversations filling the air. Jessica wore a sleek black evening gown that complemented her serious demeanor, while Eli was dressed in a sharp suit and tie. They both wore discreet earpieces to stay in constant communication, their eyes scanning the crowd for any sign of Sullivan. As they moved through the crowd, Jessica and Eli made casual conversation with various guests, their focus always on gathering information. They approached a group of influential figures discussing recent developments in local politics, hoping to glean any useful details. Amidst the mingling and socializing, Jessica spotted Sullivan across the room, surrounded by a group of admirers. He was a tall man with a commanding presence, dressed in a perfectly tailored tuxedo. His charisma was evident as he spoke, his gestures animated and his smile confident. Jessica signaled to Eli, and they made their way toward Sullivan, carefully maneuvering through the crowd. They managed to get close enough to overhear parts of his conversation. Sullivan spoke about his recent projects and his vision for the city, but there was nothing overtly incriminating in his words. Later in the evening, as the gala reached its climax, Jessica and Eli made their way to the area where Sullivan would be giving his keynote speech. They took their seats near the stage, their attention focused on the podium. Sullivan's speech began with a passionate address about community service and the importance of philanthropy. Jessica watched intently, trying to spot any signs of nervousness or hints of his involvement in Carver's operations. But Sullivan remained composed, his performance polished and convincing. After the speech, Jessica and Eli decided to take advantage of the reception that followed. They mingled with guests, trying to gather any additional information they could. Jessica approached a woman who had been chatting with Sullivan earlier, engaging her in conversation about the gala and the event's highlights. The woman was eager to talk, mentioning that Sullivan had been particularly involved in one of the evening's fundraising efforts, a new development project that was rumored to involve several influential business leaders. Jessica's heart raced. This could be a potential lead. "What kind of project is it?" she asked, her voice casual. The woman looked around conspiratorially before responding. "It's supposed to be a huge redevelopment project in the downtown area. They say it's a collaboration between Sullivan's office and a major real estate firm, but there's been a lot of speculation about the actual details." Jessica thanked her and signaled to Eli. They quickly left the gala, eager to follow up on the new lead. As they walked to their car, Jessica couldn't shake the feeling that they were getting closer to the truth. Back at Eli's office, Jessica and Eli pored over the information they had gathered. The redevelopment project mentioned by the woman seemed like a promising lead. If Sullivan was involved in this project, it could provide a direct link to Carver's operations. Eli started researching the project, looking into the companies and individuals involved. He found that the real estate firm in question had several connections to Carver's shell companies. It was starting to make sense. "This could be our breakthrough," Eli said, his voice filled with determination. "If we can prove that Carver's money is being funneled through this project, it could expose both Sullivan and Carver." Jessica nodded, her mind already racing with plans. "We need to get more information about the project. There must be contracts, financial records, or other documents that can prove the connection." As they continued their research, they realized they needed to get closer to the heart of the project. They made plans to visit the site of the redevelopment, hoping to find any evidence that could link Sullivan and Carver to the criminal activities they were investigating. The next morning, Jessica and Eli arrived at the site of the redevelopment project. It was a large, empty lot surrounded by construction barriers. The area was bustling with activity as workers and machinery prepared for the upcoming construction. Jessica and Eli approached a security guard stationed at the entrance, pretending to be interested potential investors. They managed to gain access to the site, hoping to find any documents or information that could provide the evidence they needed. They spent hours exploring the site, searching for anything that could connect Sullivan and Carver to the project. Eventually, they found a storage trailer that seemed to be filled with documents. With careful planning, they managed to slip inside and started going through the papers. Jessica's heart pounded as she sifted through the documents, looking for anything that could be useful. Finally, she found a set of contracts that mentioned Carver's shell companies as investors in the redevelopment project. It was the evidence they had been searching for. "This is it," Jessica said, her voice filled with excitement. "We've got proof that Carver's money is involved in this project." Eli nodded, his expression serious. "Now we need to get this information to the authorities. It's time to put everything we've uncovered into action." The morning sun cast a pale light over the city as Jessica and Eli made their way to the bustling heart of downtown, clutching the evidence they had found. The documents from the redevelopment project were incriminating and could potentially bring down both Henry Sullivan and William Carver. Their mission now was to get this information into the right hands, specifically those who could take decisive action against the corruption and criminal activity they had uncovered. The following day, Jessica and Eli met with District Attorney Claire Davis in her office, a sleek, modern space filled with floor-to-ceiling windows and a commanding view of the city. Claire was a seasoned prosecutor with a reputation for tackling high-profile cases. She was known for her sharp intellect and relentless pursuit of justice, making her the perfect ally in their quest to expose Sullivan and Carver. Claire listened intently as Jessica and Eli recounted their investigation and presented the evidence they had gathered. Her eyes widened as she reviewed the documents linking Carver's shell companies to the redevelopment project. "This is substantial," Claire said, her voice steady with determination. "The evidence you've collected not only implicates Sullivan, but also provides a direct link to Carver's criminal enterprise. If we can corroborate this information with additional evidence, we have a solid case." Jessica felt a glimmer of hope. "We've risked a lot to get this information. What's the next step?" Claire leaned back in her chair, her expression thoughtful. "The next step is to secure the evidence and build a case. We'll need to launch a formal investigation, which means coordinating with law enforcement and securing search warrants for Sullivan's and Carver's properties." Eli nodded. "We've already gathered significant evidence, but we need to act quickly. Carver and Sullivan are powerful, and they won't hesitate to protect their interests." Claire's face hardened with resolve. "I agree. I'll get the wheels in motion for a full-scale investigation. But we need to be careful. Sullivan and Carver will have access to top-notch legal representation and may try to obstruct our efforts. We need to be prepared for a prolonged legal battle." That evening, Jessica and Eli received a call from Claire. She had arranged for a secret meeting with an informant who claimed to have insider information about Carver's operations. The informant was reportedly a low-level employee who had recently become disillusioned with Carver's empire. The meeting was set in a secluded park on the outskirts of the city, away from prying eyes. Jessica and Eli arrived early, their senses on high alert. The park was dimly lit, with only a few scattered street lamps casting shadows across the path. They waited by a bench, their eyes scanning the surroundings for any sign of the informant. After a tense wait, a figure emerged from the darkness, a man in his mid-30s, wearing a worn leather jacket and a nervous expression. He introduced himself as Martin Hayes. "I'm glad you're here," Martin said, his voice trembling slightly. "I've been watching Carver and Sullivan for years. I've seen things that would blow your mind." Jessica and Eli exchanged a glance. "What can you tell us?" Jessica asked. Martin took a deep breath. "Carver's operations are more extensive than you know. He's been laundering money through various shell companies, and Sullivan's involvement is just the tip of the iceberg. I have documents and recordings that can prove it." Eli leaned in. "We need concrete evidence. What do you have?" Martin pulled out a folder from his jacket and handed it to Jessica. Inside were files and USB drives containing recordings of meetings, financial transactions, and internal communications. "This is everything I've gathered over the years. It's not just about the redevelopment project. Carver's network is massive. He's got connections in politics, law enforcement, and even organized crime." Jessica and Eli reviewed the contents of the folder, their eyes widening as they took in the scope of Carver's operations. The evidence was damning and could potentially unravel Carver's entire criminal network. The next day, Claire's office was abuzz with activity. The additional evidence provided by Martin Hayes was enough to push the investigation into high gear. Claire coordinated with law enforcement to execute search warrants at Sullivan's and Carver's properties, ensuring that they had the necessary resources and personnel to conduct a thorough search. Jessica and Eli accompanied the police as they raided Sullivan's mansion. The property was a sprawling estate with manicured lawns and high security. As the officers moved in, Jessica and Eli watched from a safe distance, their hearts pounding with anticipation. The search revealed a wealth of incriminating evidence, files, financial records, and communication devices that linked Sullivan directly to Carver's criminal activities. The discovery was a major breakthrough, but it was only part of the battle. Meanwhile, the search at Carver's estate was equally revealing. The authorities uncovered hidden rooms filled with more documents, weapons, and even evidence of human trafficking operations. The extent of Carver's criminal enterprise was shocking, and the implications were enormous. Claire was in constant contact with Jessica and Eli, keeping them updated on the progress of the investigation. "We've made significant strides," Claire said over the phone. "But Carver and Sullivan won't go down easily. They'll use every resource at their disposal to fight back. We need to be prepared for a legal and political battle." Jessica and Eli were determined to see the case through, but they knew they were entering dangerous territory. Carver's influence and Sullivan's connections meant that they would face fierce opposition. As the investigation continued, Jessica and Eli worked closely with Claire to ensure that the evidence was properly documented and presented. They interviewed witnesses, collected additional information, and prepared for the legal proceedings that would follow. Their efforts paid off when a grand jury indicted Henry Sullivan and William Carver on multiple charges, including corruption, money laundering, and organized crime. The indictment was a significant victory, but it was only the beginning of a long and arduous legal process. The courtroom was filled with a tense atmosphere as the trial of Henry Sullivan and William Carver reached its final stages. The room buzzed with anticipation, the air thick with a mixture of hope and anxiety. Jessica and Eli sat in the front row, their faces reflecting a mixture of relief and exhaustion. The past few months had been a whirlwind of legal battles, media scrutiny, and personal challenges, but the end was finally in sight. The previous night, Jessica had spent hours reviewing the final arguments and preparing for the emotional climax of the trial. She had spoken with Claire Davis, who assured her that the prosecution's case was strong. The evidence was overwhelming, and the testimonies of witnesses and informants had painted a damning picture of Sullivan and Carver's criminal activities. As the trial resumed, the judge entered the courtroom, and the proceedings began. Claire Davis stood up to deliver the closing argument, her voice steady and resolute. "Your Honor, members of the jury," Claire began, "the evidence presented in this trial has unequivocally demonstrated the guilt of Henry Sullivan and William Carver. We have shown beyond a reasonable doubt that they were involved in a complex network of corruption, money laundering, and organized crime. Their actions not only harmed countless individuals, but also betrayed the trust of our community." Claire's speech was powerful, her words carefully chosen to emphasize the gravity of the defendants' crimes. She spoke about the bravery of the firefighters, the lives lost, and the damage inflicted on innocent people. Jessica and Eli listened intently, feeling a mixture of pride and sadness as Claire recounted the events that had led them here. Later that day, the jury retired to deliberate. Jessica and Eli waited anxiously, their thoughts racing as they reflected on the journey that had brought them to this point. The case had taken a toll on their personal lives, but their commitment to seeking justice had never wavered. As the hours passed, Jessica felt a sense of déjà vu, recalling the moment when she and Eli had first uncovered the corruption. The journey had been fraught with danger, betrayal, and heartache, but it had also been a testament to their resilience and determination. When the jury finally returned, the courtroom fell silent. The foreperson stood and read the verdicts, guilty on all counts. Jessica felt a rush of emotion as the words echoed through the room. Sullivan and Carver were found guilty of corruption, money laundering, and other serious charges. The relief was palpable as the gavel struck, marking the end of the trial. Sullivan and Carver were led away in handcuffs, their expressions a mixture of defiance and resignation. The courtroom erupted in applause as the verdicts were announced, a wave of support for the justice that had finally been served. In the aftermath, Jessica and Eli were hailed as heroes for their role in bringing the corrupt figures to justice. The media coverage was extensive, with news outlets praising their perseverance and courage. They were interviewed on television and in newspapers, their story becoming a symbol of triumph over adversity. Jessica took a moment to reflect on the journey. The trial had been a long and arduous process, but it had led to a resolution that brought closure to the victims and their families. She felt a deep sense of satisfaction, knowing that the truth had been exposed and that the perpetrators would face the consequences of their actions. As the trial concluded, Jessica and Eli decided to return to their normal lives. The experience had changed them, and they both knew that they would carry the lessons learned with them. They had faced incredible challenges and had emerged stronger and more resilient. Jessica and Eli met at a cafe, a place they used to frequent before their lives were upended by the investigation. They sat at a corner table, sipping coffee and discussing their future. "I can't believe it's finally over," Jessica said, her voice tinged with relief. Eli nodded, a thoughtful expression on his face. "It's been a wild ride, right? I never imagined that our investigation would lead to this, but I'm glad we were able to make a difference." Jessica smiled. "Me too. It's been a challenging journey, but we've come out of it stronger. And we've done something important for the community." As they chatted about their plans for the future, Jessica felt a sense of peace. The return to normalcy was bittersweet, but it was also a chance to move forward and rebuild. Later that week, Jessica received a call from the fire department. They wanted to honor her and Eli for their bravery and dedication. They were invited to a ceremony where they would be recognized for their role in uncovering the corruption and bringing the criminals to justice. The ceremony was held at a local firehouse, a place filled with memories of courage and sacrifice. Jessica and Eli were presented with awards and expressions of gratitude from the firefighters and the community. It was a poignant moment, a reminder of the impact their efforts had made. As Jessica stood on the stage, accepting the award, she looked out at the crowd and felt a deep sense of fulfillment. The journey had been long and difficult, but it had been worth every challenge and sacrifice.